we have a situation, we talked about it in a previous amendment yesterday, whereby there are a lot of people who bought small apartments during the bubble, and they went on to have kids, and they find themselves, whereas they may have bought a small apartment on their own, or they may have bought it as a couple, they've gone from a one-person or a two-person household to a 4 or 5-person household, and they're trapped in that situation. So what we have is something that was never intended. It's a consequence of the crash, whereby you have, I think, a considerable number of people of a particular age group where they have one of 5 options available to them. So they're sitting in a small 1-2 bed apartment, let's say with 2 or 3 kids, and it is not what anyone would want for them to be bringing up their kids. So option 1 is to sell the apartment and buy a small home, buy a 2-3 bed semi-D. They can't do that because they can't save the deposit, which goes back to the conversation we had yesterday about first-time buyers, and they're in the same situation. The negative equity group, I would argue, are in a worse situation in that not only are they paying the high rents that the first-time buyers have, but because of the age difference of, let's say, 10 years, they tend to have more kids, and so they're also dealing with very high childcare costs. So option 1, which is sell the apartment and buy a 2 or 3 bed semi-D further out, isn't available to most of them because they can't save the deposit to do that. Option 2 is to keep the apartment that they have and try and get another mortgage to buy a 2 or 3 bed semi-D. Now, because of the central bank's rules on how the negative equity apartment has to be dealt with, the banks essentially will not lend them any money. We don't need to get into the detail of it, I'm happy to if you want, but basically the central bank rules are such that virtually nobody in negative equity can keep the 1 or 2 bed apartment, rent it out and get another mortgage because of the central bank rules. The third option then is that they rent out the small apartment and then they rent a 2 or 3 bed semi-D somewhere else that's more appropriate to raise the kids in. They can't do that because they're hit with double taxation, which is the purpose of this amendment. I'll come back to that. And the only 2 other options available to them are to stay in the apartment, which is what many of them are doing, and I imagine we would all agree that that's not what anyone wants. And the only other option is to rent somewhere, rent out the apartment and not declare the income to revenue, which obviously is not a situation anybody wants to be in either. So what I want to try and address here is to allow a reasonable situation, or to give these people a reasonable chance of being able to say, okay, look, we can't sell it and get another mortgage, we can't save a deposit, we can't keep it and get another mortgage. So what we can do is we'll rent it out and we'll go and we'll rent ourselves a 3 bed semi-D to raise the kids in. All right, so that's what I'm trying to achieve. Now, at the moment, the tax system does something which I believe is double taxation and an unintended consequence. I don't believe this negative equity trap was ever envisaged by the tax rules. What it does is it applies full PRSI, USC and income tax to the rental income that they receive and gives no consideration to the rent that they're paying out. So you have a household where the net income for the household, the disposable cash of the household, hasn't changed. Maybe they're getting 12 grand in rent and they're paying 12 grand out in rent. They're still paying the mortgage. So their income position is no different to a family who own the 2-3 bed semi-D and are paying it down. But their tax position changes radically. So let's assume they're taking in rent of $1,500 a month and they're paying rent in the new place of $1,500 a month. Let's assume $500 is used to pay down the interest in the apartment they own. So that is a tax deductible. So what they're left with is a taxable income coming in rent of €1,000 a month. And that, on the basis they're both out working, is being taxed at the marginal rate. So they're being hit with a tax bill of €5,000 to €6,000. So this isn't a marginal impact. This is a very, very material change to the situation. And because it's so marginal, they're trapped. So they're faced with doing one of two things. They can either break the law and hope they don't get caught by revenue, or stay in the apartment. Or some of them can say, look, which is what some are doing, is they're saying, no, we'll rent it out, we'll move to a 3-bed semi-D, we'll pay the $6,000 extra in tax every year. But on that basis, we're now stuffed. You know, we're paying rent, we're paying childcare, and we have this additional $5,000 to $6,000 a year. So that's the situation that I'm trying to avoid. Now, when I brought this to you and the officials, I got a response. Part of the response was that it would be administratively very difficult to do, because you'd have to get valuations. Is the person in negative equity? Is that changing on an annual basis? Maybe they're not in negative equity anymore, and so forth. And I agree that would be administratively very difficult to do. But in the discussions I was having on this with your officials 2 years ago, it occurred to me that actually, from a pure labour market mobility perspective, actually we shouldn't need to constrain it to negative equity. Right? That actually, let's say anybody here is living in Dublin, they own a house in Dublin, and they get reposted to Galway for 3 years. Private sector, public sector, social sector, whatever it is. So what are they going to do? They're going to rent out their house in Dublin, and they're going to rent a house in Galway. As the tax law stands, they too will be hit with about a 5,000 or 6,000 additional tax liability. And I don't think that's intended either. I don't think the tax system should say, look, your financial situation is exactly the same, your income is the same, you're living in Galway for 2 or 3 years versus Dublin, your rent in Dublin that's coming in is offsetting the rent you're paying. So your financial position is exactly the same, but if you move to Galway for 3 years, you're going to have to pay 5-6 grand in rent. So the amendment that I have proposed, and I appreciate it probably needs to be, checked by the department and by revenue and so forth, is essentially targeted at these accidental landlords to say, we don't want you hiding on revenue, and we don't want you trapped in a 1-bed apartment with 3 kids, so we're going to just make your move tax neutral. And then the way to keep it very simple is to say, do you know what, that now just applies across the board. So for anyone who's owns a home in Cork and gets a job in Donegal, you're not going to get taxed for just renting your house out and living somewhere else. Now, the way I have phrased the amendment, or tried to structure the amendment, is so that if someone were profiting from renting and renting, that the bit that they were profiting on would still be taxable income. So, for example, you rent out a house in Dublin and you rent it out for €1,500, and you move to Cork and you're only paying €1,000. So actually now your net income has gone up by €500 a month because you're paying out less than you're taking in. The amendment says that is taxable income because you are better off. You have new income coming into your household. But that if you rent out your place for $1,000 and you go and rent a new place for $1,000, be you in negative equity or be you posted from Galway to Cork to work for 2 or 3 years, you're not going to get hit with what is a very, very substantial tax bill. I think it's unintended. I think not only would this help an awful lot of people trapped in negative equity, actually I think it would improve labour mobility across the country. And whilst I imagine there may be technical reasons why you can't accept the amendment as I have drafted it, what I would very much like is agreement from you that this is what we would implement, and I'd be very happy to work with you and your officials between now and report stage to try and put something together. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Dudley.